All right, so today we are going deep on organizational change. We're going to be taking a look at a classic Harvard Business Review article, Choosing Strategies for Change. It's by John P. Cotter and Leonard A.
Oh
Schlesinger.
yeah, this is a really great article. It's considered like one of the foundational pieces in change management, so it's a good one to deep dive on.
Definitely, and it stood the test of time as the best of HBR. And,
Awesome.
it really gets into like why people resist change, which, let's face it, is something we've probably all experienced in our lives.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, who really likes change? I mean, it's hard.
It is. It can be scary.
It's uncomfortable. So yeah.
So this article kind of breaks down, why people resist change.
Yeah.
And then it also gives us like a framework for how to actually, navigate it.
Yeah. And it starts off by just acknowledging, that resistance to change is basically human nature.
Right. It's normal.
It's totally normal.
So they outline 4 main reasons people resist change. So the first one is what they call parochial self-interest, which basically means like protecting your turf, right?
Yeah, it's that fear of losing something that you value, like your position or power or, status, even just comfortable routines. And the article actually gives an example of a company that was trying to create a new VP position. And the existing VPs totally freaked out because they felt threatened.
Oh, yeah. That makes total sense.
Yeah.
Like if somebody's, adding another chair to the game of musical chairs.
Yeah.
So who's going to end up without a seat? So what about the second reason?
So the second reason they talk about is misunderstanding and lack of trust. And this can be really damaging when you're trying to implement change, especially if there's already, low trust between like management and employees. And then a change comes along that maybe isn't very clearly explained. Well, people are just naturally going to assume the worst.
Right. They're going to fill in the blanks. And it's interesting because they gave this example in the article about a company that was trying to implement flexible work hours, which on the surface sounds great. But because communication was so poor, and there was already like this mistrust between management and the employees, all these rumors started swirling around, and people actually thought that they were going to end up working more hours, not less.
Oh, wow.
So it just created this whole mess.
It really shows how important it is to communicate clearly and be transparent and really bring people along on that journey with you. You can't just spring these changes on people, especially when trust is already low.
Yeah, and I think it also highlights the importance of addressing people's concerns head on. Like, don't just ignore those rumors or those fears. Like, actually acknowledge them and, explain why things are happening the way they are.
Right.
Right. So we've got protect your turf. We've got communication breakdown. What's the third reason people resist change?
So the third one is called different assessments. And this basically means that people genuinely see the situation differently than those who are trying to initiate the change.
Right.
So it's not necessarily about resisting change itself. It's about maybe disagreeing with how it's being done or having a different perspective on what the problem actually is.
So sometimes that resistance is actually coming from a place of genuine insight.
Exactly.
Which is interesting. Like they have a piece of the puzzle that maybe the leaders don't have.
Right.
So there's this example in the article about a bank president who wanted to reorganize this department that handled real estate investment trust loans.
Oh.
But he didn't really share all the details with his team before he kind of pushed through this reorganization.
Yeah, and it turned out that his team had some additional information that actually showed that the reorganization was totally unnecessary.
Right, so it's kind of a cautionary tale.
Yeah.
About, assuming that you have all the answers.
Yeah.
And not being open to different perspectives.
Definitely.
All right, so what about the fourth reason?
Well, this one might seem kind of obvious. But some people just have a low tolerance for change. Like even small changes can feel really overwhelming for some people. So you can imagine how difficult it is for them to deal with big organizational shifts.
Yeah, we've all been there, where you're just like, ugh, not another change.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got a pretty good grasp now on why people resist change. But how do we actually manage that resistance and actually drive successful change?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Kotter and Schlesinger, they present this strategic continuum for approaching change. And it ranges from like rapid implementation, where you just kind of power through, all the way to a much slower and more participatory process. And the key is really choosing the right approach for the specific situation.
Okay, so there's no one-size-fits-all solution. So what factors should we consider when we're choosing a strategy?
Well, they highlight 4 key factors. So the first one is how much resistance are you expecting? The more pushback you anticipate, the more you need to involve people and really address those concerns up front.
Right, because if you try and force through a change when everyone is against it, that's just a recipe for disaster.
Exactly. So the second factor is power dynamics. The less power you have to just kind of dictate change, the more important it is to build consensus.
Okay. So like if I'm a middle manager who's trying to change things across different departments, I'm going to need a different approach than, say, the CEO who could just make a company-wide announcement.
Exactly.
So what about the other two factors?
So the third one is information and commitment. If you need people's knowledge and commitment to make the change actually work, then you really need to involve them early on. That way they feel like they have ownership over the process and you're more likely to get buy-in.
Yeah, it's like who knows the day-to-day work better than the people who are actually doing it.
Right, exactly. And then the final factor is urgency. So if you're in like a crisis situation, you might need to move quickly, even if it means you're going to face more resistance. Sometimes speed is just necessary.
So it's about picking the right tool from the toolbox,
Yeah,
assessing the situation, and then figuring out what's going to work best.
exactly.
Now that we've talked about the big picture, let's actually zoom in on some of those specific tools for dealing with resistance.
That's good.
We've laid the groundwork. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty.
So, when we're talking about these change management strategies, it's always helpful to look at some real world examples, to see how this stuff actually plays out in organizations.
For sure. I think theory is great, but it's always good to get practical. So were there any examples in the article that really stood out to you?
Yeah, there were a couple. One that I remember was about this manufacturing company. They were trying to implement this new performance appraisal system, and it involved these personnel counselors, and they were kind of used to having these really supportive relationships with like the production employees.
Yeah, I remember that. It was like they were going to start giving written evaluations on things like emotional maturity
Yeah.
and basically like reporting to the supervisors on their colleagues.
Right. And so these counselors saw it as like a total betrayal of trust, like turning them from like confidants into informants.
That's a perfect example of that parochial self-interest,
That's right.
Like it wasn't about the change itself. It was about what they stood to lose personally.
Yeah. And it really shows how resistance is not always about logic. It's about emotion. People
Yeah.
want to protect what's important to them.
Absolutely. So how did the company deal with that resistance? Did they just like try and bulldoze their way through?
Well, the article didn't really say how it played out, but it did emphasize, how important it is to understand where that resistance is coming from and then choose a strategy that actually addresses those concerns.
So in a case like that, maybe they could have involved the counselors in designing the new system, or at least provided some training to help them adapt to their new roles.
Right. Instead of just like imposing the change on them, they could have worked with them to help them see how they could still be like valuable resources, even in this new environment.
Yeah, it's about making people feel like they're part of the solution, not part of the problem.
Mm.
What other examples did you find interesting?
Well, there was that story about the bank president who was trying to shake things up in the department that handled those real estate investment trust loans.
Oh yeah, he was all about protecting the bank's stock
Right.
price. And he didn't really bother sharing all the details with his team before he just kind of like pushed through this reorganization.
Exactly. And that lack of transparency really came back to bite him because it turned out his team had some additional information and they knew that the reorganization was actually totally unnecessary.
So his attempt to be like decisive and act quickly actually backfired because he didn't have the full picture.
Right.
And then his team, who actually knew what was going on, resisted the change because they knew it would cause more harm than good.
Exactly. It's a good reminder that, sometimes leaders can get so focused on the big picture
Yeah.
that they miss these crucial details that are happening on the ground.
Yeah. And it also highlights how damaging it can be to assume you have all the answers. I think the best leaders are the ones who are willing to admit that they don't know everything, and they actively seek out different perspectives.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, in that example, the bank president's unilateral approach, it ended up causing way more problems than it solved. He lost some talented people, morale plummeted, and some important initiatives were completely derailed.
Ouch. That's a tough lesson. Makes you wonder how often that happens in organizations, right?
Probably more than we realize.
Leaders making decisions based on like incomplete information.
Right.
And then facing resistance from the people who are actually closer to the situation.
And that's why building trust is so important. When you have a culture of trust, people are more likely to speak up and share their concerns, even if they disagree.
So trust is like the foundation for successful change management.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it.
Okay, this is making me think. We've talked about, understanding resistance
Yeah.
and choosing the right strategy. But what about building a culture that embraces change more broadly? How do you create an organization that can adapt and thrive in the face of constant change?
That's a great question, and it's something that we can dive into more in the next part. But I think it starts with shifting the mindset around change from something to be feared to something to be embraced.
That sounds like a pretty big challenge. I mean, change is usually associated with, stress and uncertainty. So how do you kind of flip that script?
It definitely takes effort. But for now, let's just think about how those real world examples illustrate the importance of understanding where people are coming from and choosing strategies that address their concerns.
Okay, so those real-world examples we were talking about last time. They really highlight how messy change can be.
Yeah, for sure. Even with
Yeah.
the best intentions.
Yeah.
But I think that's also what makes it so interesting.
For sure. So I wanted to circle back to that question I asked at the end of the last part about, building a culture that embraces change more broadly. How do we actually create an organization that can adapt and thrive, in the
Yeah.
face of constant change?
Yeah, that's the holy grail, isn't it? Moving from that culture of fear and resistance to one of adaptability and resilience.
Exactly. But how do you get there? Change usually comes with a lot of baggage, right? Like stress, uncertainty, sometimes even loss. So
Yeah.
how do you kind of flip the script on that?
It's not easy, but I think it really starts with leadership. Leaders have to model that positive attitude toward change themselves. And they need to create an environment where people feel safe to experiment and learn.
So leading by example is key.
Hmm.
But it sounds like psychological safety is a big part of it too. Like people need to feel like it's okay to try new things, even if they don't always succeed.
Absolutely. It's about creating a culture where failure is seen as a learning opportunity, not a career-ending mistake. And it's also about celebrating those small wins along the way.
I like that, celebrating the small wins. It kind of creates those positive feedback loops.
Exactly.
And of course, communication is crucial. Leaders need to be open and honest about why changes are happening, what the challenges might be, what the desired outcomes are.
Right. When people feel like they're in the loop and their voices are being heard, they're much more likely to buy in even when things get tough.
It's about making them feel like they're part of the journey, not just passengers along for the ride.
Exactly.
It's making me think about some of my own experiences with change. The times it's gone well, there's always been that clear communication, a sense of shared purpose, and a willingness to kind of adapt along the way.
Yeah, those are great insights. And I think that's really the key takeaway here. Successfully managing change is less about following this rigid plan and more about cultivating the right mindset and culture within an organization.
I think you're right. And, we've covered so much ground today, from understanding why people resist change to exploring specific strategies for leading change. And it's clear that Kotter and Schlesinger's framework is still so relevant today.
Oh, absolutely. The business landscape might have changed a lot over the years, but human nature hasn't. We still crave stability. We're wired to resist uncertainty, and we cling to what's familiar.
Yeah, so leading change, it will always be this delicate dance. It requires empathy, adaptability, and a deep understanding of the human element.
Well said. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to encourage all of you listening to keep these insights in mind as you navigate change in your own lives. Be open to new perspectives, be willing to adapt, and never underestimate the power of clear communication and a shared sense of purpose.
It's fascinating because we've only just scratched the surface of this topic. There's so much more to learn and explore when it comes to change management.
I'm glad you enjoyed the deep dive. It's been a pleasure unpacking these ideas with you. And remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Keep reflecting, keep learning, and keep sharing your insights with others. After all, the only constant is change, right? And by embracing it together, we can create a more adaptable, resilient, and successful future.
Love that. And on that note, we'll sign off for today. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.